Considered as one of the most legendary racetracks to ever exist and the home of some of the greatest races the world has ever seen, this track has had its fair share of history, and today I'm going to be talking about just that. The complete history of the famous green hell, the Nürburgring Nordschleife. The building of the Nürburgring began in 1925 after the idea was put forward to create a track in Germany that could rival the likes of Monza. It took 2 long years to build the 15-mile circuit, with the first official race at the track being a motorcycle race taking place on the 18th of June 1927. The very next day, the first car race was held there, being won by Rudolf Caracciola. Before I go on, I think it would probably be good to clarify the different layouts of the Nürburgring to avoid any confusion later on. The modern track has 3 main variants. The 12-mile long Nordschleife, meaning Northern Loop, the 3-mile Nürburgring Grand Prix circuit, and the 15-mile Nürburgring combined circuit, where the Grand Prix circuit and the Nordschleife fuse together to create this massive racetrack. There's also 2 additional variants that were both discontinued in 1982. The 4-mile long Südschleife, meaning Southern Loop, and the weirdly shaped Betonschleife. At this time during the late 20s, the modern Grand Prix circuit didn't yet exist, so most big races happened at the insanely dangerous Nordschleife. Saying this racetrack was only dangerous though is an understatement. Most of the track had no guardrails whatsoever, so if you made a mistake, you'd either fly off into a bush or, if you're unlucky, a tree. This danger is proved by the fact that during this period before World War II, 8 people had already died in accidents at the track. The Nürburgring was truly a test of bravery. Any mistake could be your last. But even still, the Nürburgring was incredibly popular, and the original idea to create a racetrack to rival Monza was definitely achieved. At the 1933 German Grand Prix, Rudolf Caracciola found a small exploit in practice where on one corner he would hook his inside wheels into a ditch on the corner's apex. This clever tactic made him 2 seconds a lap quicker than everyone else until other drivers noticed and began to copy his trick. This exploit was eventually discovered and the ditch was concreted over so it couldn't be done again. Little did they know that this would become the Nürburgring's most famous corner. The Caracciola Carousel, or simply the Carousel, which is still pretty much the same almost 90 years later. The Nürburgring had an incredibly successful first decade until motor racing was stopped in 1939 when the Second World War broke out and the Nürburgring was left abandoned. In 1947 the Nürburgring reopened for racing, and in 1951 it became part of the newly formed Formula 1 World Championship. Legendary new drivers such as Juan Manuel Fangio and Jim Clark rose to the immense challenge of the Nürburgring during the 50s and 60s, with the track becoming a staple of F1 alongside the likes of Silverstone, Spa, Monaco and Monza. The track wasn't exclusive to F1 however. The 1,000 kilometers of the Nürburgring was introduced in 1953 as part of the World Sports Car Championship. In 1970 the 24 hours of the Nürburgring was created for the World Touring Car Championship. And the German Motorcycle Championship carried on at the Südschleife just as it did before World War II. But generally, the Nürburgring was most famous for being a venue for Grand Prix racing and more specifically Formula 1. Unfortunately though, the Nürburgring was still a death trap. The 3-time race winner Peter Collins was killed in a crash at the Nürburgring at the 1958 German Grand Prix. This insane danger of the Nürburgring was a massive problem, and in the late 60s, steps were taken to improve driver safety, such as adding a chicane on the main straight to reduce top speed. After F1 champion Jackie Stewart won the 1968 German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring, he famously called it the Green Hell, a nickname that stuck for the last half century as a reflection to anybody daring enough to step up to the challenge and face the dangers the track has to offer. In 1970, after the death of Piers Courage at Zandvoort, the F1 drivers planned to boycott the German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring unless any major safety improvements were made. This surprise boycott forced the German Grand Prix to the Hockenheimring instead, once again proving the Nürburgring was way too dangerous. The Nürburgring listened to the F1 drivers' complaints. The bushes that previously lined the edges of the track were removed and replaced with grass and barriers similar to the Nürburgring of today. And the track was also made smoother at certain parts where the cars would previously go airborne after a sudden jump in the road. Despite their best efforts to make the Nordschleife a safer track, the 70s would prove to be its downfall. Since the Nordschleife was so incredibly big compared to any other racetrack, it made it virtually impossible at the time to cover the race for people watching on TV. And also the Nordschleife required 5 times as many marshals and medical staff than a normal track, which was something the organisers just simply couldn't provide. But the real nail in the coffin for the Nürburgring using the Nordschleife in F1 happened at the infamous 1976 German Grand Prix. If you know about this race or you've seen the movie Rush, you probably know what I'm talking about. Before the race, reigning world champion Niki Lauda attempted to start a boycott against the safety of the track, similar to what had happened in 1970. But this time it wasn't as successful, and the majority argued the race should go on. This would prove to be a fateful decision, as on lap 2 of the race, Lauda's car snapped to the right and smashed into the guardrail, leaving him completely engulfed in flames and stranded right in the middle of the track. He was pulled out and saved by fellow drivers Guy Edwards, Harold Ertel and Brett Lunger, and was transported to a local hospital where his severe burns could be treated. It's nothing short of a miracle that Lauda lived to tell the tale, but it certainly didn't do any favours for the Nürburgring. That race, on the 1st of August 1976, would be the last time the Nordschleife would ever be used in F1, and it would take almost a decade for the Nürburgring to be reborn. In 1984, the modern Grand Prix circuit that we know today was built and hosted that year's European Grand Prix before returning as the host of the German Grand Prix the next year. This brand new 3-mile GP circuit was built where the former Südschleife used to be and was purpose built to meet the highest safety standards of the time. Although nowadays the circuit is considered one of the greatest racetracks of all time, back then people hated this thing. People said this new GP circuit was just a shadow of the Nordschleife and it generally produced bad racing with very few overtakes, earning it nicknames such as Ersatzring, roughly meaning inferior circuit, since people believed it didn't deserve to bear the name of the Nürburgring. The new Nürburgring GP circuit might have been a failure, but in my opinion, the opening race at the circuit might just be one of the greatest races of all time. On the 12th of May 1984, the opening of the Nürburgring GP circuit was celebrated by a race driven in identical Mercedes W201s. Which sounds pretty boring, but the drivers inside the cars, well, they were anything but boring. The race consisted of 17 F1 drivers, of which 9 were former champions and all of them were former Grand Prix winners. At the race you had Elio De Angelis, Jack Brabham, James Hunt, Niki Lauda, Jacques Latif, Alan Jones, Phil Hill, Denny Hulme, Sterling Moss, Alain Prost, Carlos Reutemann, Keke Rosberg, Jody Scheckter, John Surtees and John Watson. When I said all of them were Grand Prix winners though, that's not exactly true. There was one more driver at that race who at the time was an F1 rookie who nobody had ever heard of. His name was of course Ayrton Senna, and unbelievably in the same car as everyone else, he somehow won the race. He won from none other than second place Niki Lauda, who was already a double world champion and will go on to become that year's champion. This drive from the young, inexperienced Ayrton Senna is, in my opinion, one of the greatest drives the world has ever seen, if not the greatest drive the world has ever seen. The Nürburgring Grand Prix circuit was used in F1 in 1984 and 1985, but after that it disappeared from the calendar for a whole decade. It wouldn't be until the 1995 German Grand Prix won by Michael Schumacher where the track would finally make its triumphant return. Even though the largely forgotten Nordschleife was left by F1, it was far from abandoned. Most notably, the annual 24 hours of the Nürburgring endurance race carried on in the 80s and 90s just as it had done since it was founded in 1970. However, the Nordschleife had definitely taken a fall in grace. The days of Formula 1 and the World Sports Car Championship descending upon the fearsome green hell were gone, with all the attention now being on what will come in the 21st century. In 2002, the Nürburgring GP circuit was extended slightly from its original design in 1984, adding a new complex of corners called the Mercedes Arena. For F1, this would be the host of the European Grand Prix up until 2007, and the German Grand Prix in 2009, 2011 and 2013, and hasn't been used since. The German Grand Prix has taken place at the Hockenheimring from 2014 onwards, but it will only be a matter of time before F1 returns to the Nürburgring. F1 had left the Nürburgring, but the legendary circuit is still a staple in touring cars. The German DTM Touring Car Championship started to use the circuit in 2000, and it's still included on the calendar to this day 20 years later. And the World Touring Car Championship returned to the Nürburgring in 2015 after briefly racing there once in 1987. The Nordschleife still allows public track days, as it has for almost 100 years, and is still home to the annual 24 Hours of the Nürburgring, as it's done since 1970. The VLN Championship has also been held there since 1977, with its most famous race being the 6 Hours of the Nürburgring. And while I'm on the topic of the 6 Hours of the Nürburgring, at the 1998 race, F1 champion Jack Brabham somehow took part at the old age of 72, which is just insane. From 1925 to 2020, the Nürburgring has come a long way, but unlike tracks like Silverstone, a lot of it has stayed pretty much identical to when it was first built all those years ago. It's been a long time since the days of the fearsome green hell, and it's evolved into a true icon of the motorsport world. But anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed this video talking about the complete history of the Nürburgring. If you did, be sure to like, comment and subscribe for weekly videos every Sunday, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye!